Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ask the Experts. We've got Azure Functions Edition today. My name is Gwen. I'll be your host. I'm a cloud developer advocate here at Microsoft, a big fan of functions. And also, I've got the honor to be the host for this Ask the Experts sessions. And we've got two awesome team members from the functions team. We've got Eamon and Raman. Do you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourselves here? Eamon, I want to start with you.
Sure, Gwen. Thanks. Really appreciate the time. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Eamon O'Reilly. I'm a lead PM for Azure Functions and mostly focus on all things serverless inside of the Azure platform.
Hey everyone, I'm Ramya Urganti and I'm really excited to be part of this Ask the Expert session. And thanks, Gwen, for hosting us. So I'm currently working as a PM with Azure Functions, and my focus areas are everything about enabling functions on Kubernetes. So I work on triggers as well, and they're into this event streaming space, such as Kafka, and SQL, RabbitMQ, to name some. And I also work on KEDA, which helps with scaling of pods and Kubernetes. So yeah, we're looking forward to the session today. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure the questions are going to come just running in. I'd like to invite everyone who is watching to just make sure you drop your questions in the chat because we're here to answer all of those. Do want to just quickly remind you all, code of conduct in summary. Let's be respectful to everyone who's in the chat, who's in the audience, but also to people who are speaking and whatnot. We want to create a very friendly and respectful environment for all of us here. But I think we could actually just dive into our first question because we've already got one here. And I've got this one here that says, what are some of the key differentiators you see when using Azure Functions? Eamon, I want to send this one over to you.
Awesome, Gwen. Yeah, no, thanks. I think the really important thing to consider when you're looking at Azure Functions is, what are you trying to accomplish in your business? What kind of applications are you trying to build? And do they lend themselves well to Azure Functions? So once you've decided on using event-driven architecture and the benefits of using that, some of the things that Azure Function really helps with is the goal of reducing the maintenance of the infrastructure. So as you know, when we're building traditional applications, a lot of times we have to be concerned about managing the underlying infrastructure that hosts our applications. And often the biggest challenge is trying to right-size that infrastructure to meet your application needs. And those two things take a lot of time from developers and IT teams. And I think one of the goals we have with Azure Functions and serverless in general is to remove a lot of those requirements around management of the infrastructure, but also the dynamic scaling nature of it. And so what Azure Functions gives you is that kind of built-in capability to not worry about, is my application going to be patched with the latest security updates? Do I need to worry about how the reboots are doing? Is this thing going to scale if I get a burst in activity? Those capabilities are kind of offloaded into the Azure Functions service and allows you to kind of focus more on, building the application, releasing it, and kind of getting value out to your business teams. And I think the other differentiator we spend a lot of time on in Azure Functions is, this concept of the Azure Functions programming model. And when you think about Azure Functions and you're trying to build applications, a lot of time is spent trying to integrate into those systems that you want to actually take action on. So typically, you're using event hubs, you're sending a bunch of data up there and you want it to be processed. But, you could spend a lot of times putting the plumbing into how do I connect to the event hubs, how do I maintain the pooling, what happens if it goes down, the failing, all of those capabilities. We kind of have the ability with our programming model to abstract away that for you. So you just actually get the events you're interested in. And not only do you get the events you're interested in, you get them in the schema that you can actually work on them directly inside of the functions programming application. And so that really allows you as a developer to kind of focus on what is the business logic I'm supposed to be doing on these events and not have to worry about the plumbing on how do I connect to get those events, or if I need to send those events to a down-level system like Cosmos DB so that they can be processed by clients. That also, we have this concept of output bindings where, again, you just give us the process data and we take care of the connection and plumbing and all the requirements to send that forward. And so it really tries to make the lives of developers a lot easier so that it's just business logic and the plumbing we try to abstract away from.
That's awesome, Eamon. Yeah, I'm a big fan of serverless development, and firsthand of experience, just how time saving it is to not have to worry about your infrastructure and whatnot. So thank you for that one. We already got another one here as well. But what are the open source components required to run functions in Kubernetes? Rami, I'm going to send this one over to you.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question. And actually, thanks for asking this question. I think it's very important to know, right? Like what happens under the hood when a function app is deployed on Kubernetes. So the Azure Function Service is made up of two key components. So whenever a function app is kind of deployed on a Kubernetes cluster, so a runtime and a scale controller gets deployed. So the functions runtime essentially runs and executes your code, and this is a Docker container which actually contains the runtime. So the other component is a scale controller. So this is an open source component and it's called KEDA, which stands for Kubernetes Event Driven Auto Scaling. And this component helps with scaling of function apps, to scale to 0 when there are no events occurring and scale out to n instances as per the events. So in case you have requirements to scale the function apps, then we recommend you to leverage this open source component called KEDA.
Awesome. It's interesting to see how these things work together, because oftentimes you'll see the discussion of containers versus serverless when in reality they're meant to work together and whatnot, right?
Yeah, I think that is one of the benefits, Gwen, is I think a lot of our customers may not be familiar that, Azure Functions is open source.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about Kubernetes and how it runs there and all the work that Rami is doing with the team and feedback from customers, there's a lot of scenarios where you do want to leverage Kubernetes, but you still want all the benefits of the programming model, the scale capabilities, and by kind of open sourcing all those capabilities, you get that inside of Kubernetes if you need it as well. But obviously, we offer that in the full side of Azure Functions also.
Awesome, and it looks like we've got a couple more questions here. That's awesome. Keep them coming. Next one here I've got is, when would I choose the consumption or premium plan when building my application? Eamon?
Yeah, so I think we get asked this, quite a bit. I think it's one of the first things, the developers and customers experience when they're building out their applications. Obviously, the default answer would be go with consumption. Consumption is that kind of optimized pay-per-use scenario where you just build your code, we run it, everything is kind of optimized from the inner loop experience to the outer loop experience, how it runs, how it scales. And it actually meets most customers' needs. The reason to think about the premium plan is there are some workloads that actually require kind of different profiles than what the normal kind of small serverless functions often are. And typically, if you're trying to remove cold start, we'll say as an example, and you have APIs, you don't want any cold start, then premium allows you to basically pre-allocate instances up front. And you still get all the dynamic scaling that you want. So it'll scale instances as they're needed, but it does allow you to kind of warm up one instances to remove cold start. And similarly, you may have capabilities where you want your functions to run longer than our default 10 minutes. So, typically we would encourage you to write small functions that execute well, but, sometimes for whatever reason, you need them to run longer, then you can run them up for like a guaranteed SLA of an hour inside of premium, and often they will run longer than that. And I think the other reason to consider premium is if you need integration into like your on-premises environments or other environments that are controlled by VNets. So if you have networking requirements that kind of force you into a controlled environment through VNets, then premium offers those capabilities as well. And I think the last thing that premium offers is a lot of our applications sometimes they don't run in the CPU and memory that we allocate in consumption. And so if you need a higher SKU size because you need more CPU, you need more memory, you need more I/O, those types of capabilities are available in premium, where you get to pick what kind of compute that your functions are going to run on.
Okay. So in summary, start with consumption.
Yes.
You're probably going to get a lot out of it. That's great to know.
Network consumption has all of the core capabilities, and it's only if you have some of these extra needs, then you do know that premium is available for you.
Awesome. Ramya, it looks like we've got another one for you here, talking a little bit more about KEDA here, but what are some of the triggers that I can use with KEDA?
Yeah, so you can pretty much use, all the functions supported triggers when you're deploying function apps and running them on a Kubernetes environment. But if you have requirements to scale as per the number of events, then you will need the respective KEDA scaler to obviously scale the function apps. So currently you can use Event Hub's KEDA scaler and the respective functions, Event Hub's triggers or bindings, and queue scalers, service bus, blob, Kafka, and RabbitMQ. So there are out of the box KEDA scalers available for the services that I just mentioned, and you can use alongside with function apps to kind of have that scaling capability. On the other hand, like HTTP has been like one of the popular triggers and apps that users typically run, and we have an external scaler, and that this is something that you'll have to install it separately, and it pretty much supports all of the ingress controllers like NY and Nginx. But then this like I said, it has to be separately installed, and it's currently in public preview. So you're also looking at reviewing it, launching it to GA as well.
Awesome. That is actually great to know. I didn't really know that either. Alrighty, moving on here. Eamon, I've got one for you. I know most people might know that you can actually create functions in the portal, and that was actually how I created my first function, and I was amazed because I was like, oh my goodness, a couple of clicks on the portal and I hit run, and then I have a very basic but fully running API, right? But I wanted to take my functions development to the next step, and obviously I needed to have a local development environment. So could you talk to us a little bit about what tools are available to build and test my functions locally?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Gwen. I think we have that basic portal experience like you talked about, and it's kind of, if you're just trying to write a simple function, get things started, make sure you understand how the functions experience works, the dependencies. The portal, is a way to get started, but it has very limited capabilities because it's not a full rich IDE. And so a lot of times customers, as they start thinking about how do I put this into production, what's my CI/CD pipeline going to look like, how do I enforce all my security and company compliance, you kind of eventually drop into one of the richer IDEs that has a lot more integration across the board for those experiences. And so, we support a lot of different languages and functions. So, with .NET and PowerShell, but then we have Java, Python, you could write in Node. And so what we tried to do from the IDE is make that local dev experience as integrated into the tool sets that developers are used to as much as possible. And so we have like IntelliJ integration if you're trying to do Java, and kind of make easy to develop those applications inside the IDE. And one of the differentiators we have is we don't depend on the cloud resources to build and test a lot of your applications. So that rich kind of, how do I increase my inner loop experience so that I can quickly set things up, I can set the debugger, I can run it, I can validate everything. That's one of the core things we try to do inside the IDE. And obviously for other languages like .NET, we have built-in integration with Visual Studio because we know a lot of our customers love that experience and they're very familiar with it. So you can build your functions and test them directly inside of there, but then take advantage of all the integration with the tooling like GitHub for your CI/CD and others. And then the other one we have is obviously VS Code. And we're seeing, I think the huge growth in VS Code just because of its simplicity, its portability, it runs everywhere. And so, we have probably some of our better integrations in with VS Code because we see lots of different languages being used in there. Customers are writing PowerShell in there, they're writing Python in there, we see them writing JavaScript in there. And so that one we spend a lot of time to really try to make that experience as good as possible. And then lastly, I think, we should also realize that a lot of developers, they have their own different IDEs or they're not using IDEs at all. And so we have what we call core tools, Azure Functions Core Tools. And this is a command line experience that allows you to build and test and debug everything locally as well, just using the command line tools, and you can integrate those into whatever kind of IDE you have as well. And so lots of different options, but it is an area we focus a lot on from the function side, is to really try to increase that productivity for the developers so that where they spend their time is valuable, and we want them to kind of get as much out of that local dev experience as they can.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned this sort of earlier on in your answer here about the actual capabilities of it working with functions in the portal. If I'm sort of like a new developer, would you recommend would you recommend I start in the portal and then move into, or should I go full local setup right away? What's the guidance there?
I think what we typically see for new developers just trying to learn functions is in some ways, there's more to just writing the piece of the app. You kind of have to understand a little bit of how your monitoring is going to work, how the applications work, how functions are related to apps. And so I think a browse through the portal is a good place to start by just creating a function app, go inside of there, try to understand, okay, what are the different concepts? Do I have the information architecture right on how this function app works? And then write, maybe a few lines of code just to make sure like you can run it, you can kind of see how the monitoring works, and understand the relationship between things inside of the functions experience. We try to make it as useful as possible, but it's nice. I think we see a lot of our developers start there just to get a feel for it. Like, what am I dealing with? Once you kind of have a good understanding of what's available, then I think the IDE is the preference to go to when you try to build even a POC, like any kind of a rich POC. I would go down the IDE experiences. They do have integration directly into the Azure API, so you can do some management capabilities as well, like publish your code up there. You can stream monitoring directly from the cloud back into your IDE. So the rich experience you're going to get there. So I would encourage people to kind of, once they've kind of done a flyby, I would say almost on the functions app experience and created it, do like write a little bit of code, then I would encourage them to kind of move back into the IDEs, and that's where they get a full rich experience.
Okay. I mean, I feel like you've covered a lot of this next question that I wanted to ask you too, but any sort of general advice for people wanting to, like the best way to get started using Azure Functions?
Like, I think the easiest thing to do is go through some of the tutorials we have. If you just think about, you're obviously going to have your own scenarios and your own kind of workloads that you're trying to implement. But I think the most important thing to get started is to try to carve off just a small little application POC that you want to do. Don't try to go too large, because partly what you want to do is you're moving into this event-driven architecture. And event-driven architecture has benefits associated with it, because now you're not doing this, request response and, how fragile that can get when you're doing traditional HTTP calls, especially multiple ones. And you get the reliability and distributed nature that functions gives you. So you kind of want to say, okay, not only am I learning a new service, I may also be learning a new programming paradigm. And how do I take advantage of that? And so in some ways, I would start very small. And the tutorials are good, because what we find a lot of customers is writing the code is actually not that hard. Like, it's, because we do a lot of this programming models, triggers and bindings, the writing the code is somewhat easy, and integrating is, done a lot for you. But there's a whole life cycle around the application as well. How do I do my deployment? How do I debug it? Like, what security are we talking about? Do I need to do networking? Is application insights, is the monitoring the way I want? All of those kind of life cycle experiences you're going to have to learn. What we find with a lot of customers is start very small, understand the life cycle of your application, because once you've embedded that into your dev teams and your organization, it's very easy to iterate from there, because nothing ever changes generally around the application lifecycle and the dev experience. The only thing that's changing now is that application code that you want to keep writing to do more and more value for your business. So there will be a little bit of that upfront time. I think it's worth spending to understand all of this. And then you'll be able to accelerate, I think, from there, because now you're just like focused on just writing the function code, and you understand all of the other parts of the system.
Awesome. That's actually great advice along the lines of sort of getting started and knowing what you can actually do with functions. We've got a question here from the audience asking, what are examples of using functions in apps, for example, in HR app or something? I'm sure both of you have plenty of examples of how functions can actually work in production. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can do a couple, and then maybe Ramya can do a couple that might be more even on the area she works on. I think, there's kind of two main things we see functions. One, obviously, is a lot of APIs are built with functions, and a lot of kind of webhook capability are built with functions that just allow you to do a little bit of business processing. So that's a very common scenario we see customers doing. I think the other one that shines for functions even more is, a lot of this kind of real-time processing of data. And so what we're noticing, I think, out in the customer base right now is there's so much more data that customers are having to process to be able to differentiate from competitors and make sure they can do good insights on that data. And so there's so much coming from like IoT devices, from analytics data, and oftentimes it's being sent into systems like event hubs, because you want to be able to process that data, add some metadata to it, perhaps store it so that down-level clients can then benefit from that information. And so a lot of the core scenarios around how do I do kind of real-time, stream processing of that data and be able to, persist it for, other systems down level. And so I think that's, a very common scenario that we see customers doing. There are a lot of other scenarios customers do around ML and how to kind of update inferencing dynamically on your models. So that's very common. Mostly when you think about it is, can I use kind of an event-driven architecture to solve my business problem? And if you can, then functions is a very good candidate for that because it solves a lot of the challenges you might normally have as you build these out. Rami, I don't know if you have a couple on the ones you focus on as well.
No, I think you touched upon really good examples of, the usage of functions, especially in event-driven architectures. So I think users are moving away from monolithic kind of architectures and moving more towards, microservices, event-driven based, and functions kind of helps with providing serverless capabilities on an event-driven kind of architectures, and especially and stream processing is increasingly becoming a vital part of these complex distributed systems, to kind of manage large amounts of data that are coming in as continuous stream of events in real time. So services like Azure Functions and then event hubs and Kafka, combination of these are really powerful and easy to use services which will enable you to build that real-time event-driven applications running on these distributed systems. So we're actually seeing several scenarios around customers using Azure Functions to kind of respond to and even kind of touched upon this, right? Like database changes or events that are coming in from this real-time systems and IoT systems, and including their custom logic with the out-of-the-box capabilities that Functions provides with the bindings and triggers, and adding their custom logic with respect to the actions that the specific API or app that needs to take, and then moving them on to stateful systems like a database like SQL or Snowflake, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing Azure Functions is kind of bridging this real time to the analytics and processing systems, and it's playing a vital role in kind of bridging these two worlds.
Yeah. And the one thing I would just add to that is if you do go to the functions documentation, on the bottom under resources, there's a bunch of samples that have been written that kind of are real world examples that have, their sample code up on GitHub. So you can go look at what other customers are doing, go look at those samples. A lot of times these are built by our CDAs and, other people inside of Microsoft after working with customers to kind of understand what are those common scenarios, and then can we build reference architecture so that other customers can also leverage and kind of jumpstart their engagement. And so, that's a good place to start as well if you're looking for kind of like end-to-end scenarios that are, available with the code, but also good documentation that details, what to think about when you're building those apps.
It's a good call out. Check out the docs. Plenty of resources there. We've got another question here from the audience. Is there any way to see the app insights logs immediately? I think at the moment there's like a couple of minutes delay there, but
yeah. So this is an area that we've done a lot of work kind of with the application insights to basically try to get those kind of logs all the way up as fast as possible. There is maybe a couple of minutes that's still there, Gwen, but there are two options available to you. One is we introduced the streaming API from application insights into the system. So it's available in the portal and through VS Code. And so what this allows you to do is if you're on a function and you just execute it directly, you will get real-time logs directly from application insights into that streaming API. So you will be able to see the real-time logs as they come through. And then the other way you can do it is if you go into the application insights as well, you can see the live logs come through as well from that experience. But if you want the full kind of end-to-end logs of a function that's already been run, and you just missed it, then you do have that couple of minute wait, but we are kind of actively working on reducing that down as much as possible. So I would kind of leverage the real-time streaming APIs that are built into the portal experience for application insights and the test window or through VS Code if you need something immediately.
Awesome. So there's two options right there, actually.
Yeah, they both call the same API, but yes. Yeah. Two different ways to get there.
That's awesome. Rami, I do have a question here for you. It says, we would like to implement error handling in the apps using the Kafka extension for functions. Is there an out-of-box solution for this?
Yeah, right. So error handling is like uh, very important when you're writing these APIs and apps. And yeah, I think great question there. And Eamon also talked about the life cycle experiences that functions offers out of the box, right? Like from local dev, IDE experience to debugging to monitoring to and finally to deploying to Azure. So in the, like so functions is kind of providing that, the environment and client tooling and monitoring that is needed, and there is capabilities inside out also that is offered, right? Like error handling mechanisms. So I would like to like take an example, right? Like Apache Kafka extension for Azure Functions today supports retry policy. So this essentially tells the runtime to rerun a failed execution until the successful completion occurs or the maximum retries has reached. So and like I said, so error handling is very important to kind of avoid the data loss or miss events, or also monitor the health of an application. So retry policy is also evaluated when a trigger function raises an uncaught exception, right? So as a best practice, it's recommended you catch all the exceptions in your code and rethrow any errors that you want to result in a retry. And going back to the example, right, like the Kafka extension, we've recently launched this retry policy, and it supports two types of retry strategies. One is around fixed delay, and the other one is exponential backoff. So fixed delay is mostly around like user gets to specify an amount of time, and it's allowed to elapse between each race. So this amount of time that the user provides, so the retry comes in and tries and then goes back, and then after the elapsed time that the user gives it, it again comes back. So there's another approach, like I mentioned, right, like the exponential backoff. So the first retry, it first retries, waits for a minimum delay, and then on subsequent retries, the time is added exponentially to the initial duration for each retry until the maximum delay is reached. So this the exponential backoff kind of adds some randomization to delays, but it's really helpful during high throughput scenarios.
Awesome. So, I mean, there's plenty to look into that as well. So the answer is yes. There's an option. There's options here. We are just at about time, but I do want to invite people to our. We actually have another Ask the Experts happening with another, I guess, serverless service that we have. It's going to be September 29th, 9 a.m. It's Ask the Experts Azure Container Apps. So all your Azure Container apps and questions and curiosities, please be sure to bring them to that session as well. I also would like to invite people to check out Serverless September. The URL is at that top right, that aka.ms/serverless-september. There's blog posts, there's videos, there's hacks, there's live streams, Zero to Hero, Cloud Skills Challenge, Community Buzz, all on Code, Containers Cloud. We're talking functions, container apps, logic apps, event grid, and a bunch more. So do be sure to check that out. I do want to thank our hosts, myself, and then our guests, Eamon and Ramya, for being here. Any last words, any last advice for people in the Azure Functions community and people attending the event here?
Yeah, no, I think the big thing, thanks again, Gwen, is, that content we're doing for Serverless September, it's a great way to kind of, get in, try things out, do some POCs, learn the service, get with the community, leverage all the resources that are, and just, hopefully you get excited about the new way to build applications. We're definitely excited from our side. We see tons of customers doing so as well. So I'd love people to get involved, give us feedback, let us know what they'd like to see, and engage as much as possible so we can kind of continually make the service better as we go forward.
Awesome. Rama, any last words, anything you'd like to share?
I want to echo what Eamon said. Like, we're putting through a lot of content with in the form of blogs, and there are also webinars that we're doing. So yeah, it'll be good to kind of get feedback from customers and how they think about the features that we are releasing, and so that we can get this feedback and iterate on top of it, and make Azure Functions better.
Awesome, everyone. Thank you so much. That's been it for this episode of Ask the Experts, Azure Functions.